So, first of all, what was the Spartacus Revolution? Well, first of all, during World War One, obviously Germany was fighting against the Allies, and they were being blockaded by the British Navy, and at a certain point they were surrounded on all sides. So, although by 1918 they had defeated the Russians on the Eastern Front and knocked them out of the war and stuff, it still was a thing where they were getting ground down on the Western Front. And this caused a lot of dissatisfaction for many of the people in Germany. And in particular, there were many sailors in the north of Germany, along the kind of Baltic coast and the North Sea coast. And many of them had kind of been stuck in their ports and stuff. And many of them were very angry, and they end up, leading an uprising, basically a mutiny, and this mutiny spilt over to basically end up becoming a full-blown revolution in which the industrial workers of Germany end up rising up against the Kaiser's regime. So the Kaiser, who was the emperor, he ended up being overthrown and he was thrown into exile, and there was the new republic that was established, which later became known as the Weimar Republic, which was named after a small city in Germany and stuff, right? And so that's how the Weimar Republic ended up being formed. However, as with all revolutions, there's never just the revolution, right? There's always after effects of it. There's always kind of aftershocks, and so this is kind of what we saw with this revolution as well. So basically, during the war, you had a split between the kind of socialists, right? So prior to the war, around the world, socialists had all kind of believed in the idea of, the workers of the world have no nation, workers of the world unite, right? And so there was the idea that, working people from England, from Germany, from Russia, from France, etc., that they had more in common with people of the same class as them than they do with the elites, like the aristocrats and the bourgeois, basically the business people and stuff, right? Now, World War One kind of threw a spanner into all that theory, because the working class of the countries end up basically being right, we feel more solidarity with our fellow countrymen than we do with workers from different countries, right? And they enthusiastically were behind the war. So people who had this kind of notion of this internationalism, World War One basically kind of disproved that theory, that actually people feel more kinship with their fellow countrymen, even if they're a higher class, or a lower class, than they do with foreigners, basically. In the same way, you might have a factory worker in England and a factory worker in India. The two of them on completely different wages and stuff, and they will still feel more of a connection with someone from with the factory owners from England and the factory owners from India, respectively, right? So it's kind of something to kind of bear in mind, that the war led to this split between the socialist movement. So there was a faction of the socialists, who they became known as the Spartacist League, and this Spartacist League, they were ones who were very much opposed to the war, right? So Spartacus, for anyone who's seen the film Spartacus, it's a very famous Stanley Kubrick film, although he didn't really want to make the film. That's something which we'll cover in a few months' time when we're going on into film reviews and stuff. So definitely stay tuned for that. Kubrick's a big inspiration for me. But anyway, so Spartacus was a slave during Roman times, and he rose up against the Roman Empire, and led a huge slave rebellion, which eventually ended up being crushed, which is kind of ominous, because you'd think that they would champion a slave who led a rebellion that was successful. I don't know why you'd want to follow a slave rebellion which wasn't successful. But anyway, the point is that they call themselves the Spartacus, right? And the Spartacus, as soon as the war began in 1914, they set up the Spartacus League. And basically what ended up happening was basically a split between the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which I think is the SPD, or maybe I've got it the wrong way around or whatever, but either way. So you end up having a split within that movement, between the ones who were basically pro-war and the ones who tended to be more communist, and these the ones who were very much anti-war. So now that the war had obviously finished and stuff, and Germany had surrendered and signed the armistice documents, right? Basically, Germany ended up being in a bit of a tumultuous stage at this point. So obviously you had some people who really wanted to further the revolution, and then you had other people who wanted to kind of conserve it and stuff, right? Whenever there's a revolution, you have to like appeal to some sort of like moderation and stuff, yeah. You have to, in order to like consolidate things, yeah. You can't completely alienate people by becoming too radical, and so while like the main people who were in charge, like most notably President Friedrich Ebert, who was the first president of the Weimar Republic, while he was trying to appeal to kind of moderates and middle class people and to like the former like kind of like Prussian military, etc., etc., these people here were taking things very like radical, right? And the Spartacist movement was led in particular by Karl Liebknecht and by Rosa Luxemburg, who we touched on last time when we were talking about the Paris Commune, right? So definitely check that video out because yeah, there's lots of like good stuff in that, as there are with all of our videos. So the Spartacus League was committed to undoing three things in particular, right? One was militarism, two was imperialism, and the third was capitalism, which for them they saw as being all one and the same. They saw World War One as not a clash between nations, but basically a war between like different competing capitalists, right? So this is basically a bourgeois war which has been like fought with like the blood and sweat of the proletariat of the different countries, right? So they basically were opposed to all this kind of stuff, and as it was said in the Spartacus manifesto, I'm going to basically paraphrase it now. They said that basically it's not a question of, democracy or dictatorship, yeah? They said it's a question between bourgeois democracy, which is basically the kind of like liberal democracy, which we all know about, yeah? Or socialist democracy, right? So these people were on the face of it, were advocating for democracy as they saw it, right? And they said, like, to quote what Marx said in terms of like the dictatorship of the proletariat, what they basically said is that the dictatorship of the proletariat should not basically be done by violent means, right? As had been kind of advocated by Marx, but had to be done through kind of like mass organization, had to be done through the political system. What they had been arguing for is that the revolution ought to be peaceful, and it ought to also be popular. It ought to be a grand, like kind of a general upswelling of the people themselves, taking over factories, taking over the means of production and stuff, yeah. And that's how the revolution ought to be kind of managed. However, in early January of 1919, yeah, so like on January the 5th, they decided, right, what we're going to do is we're going to fly in the face of all of that, and we're going to have a violent revolution, right? So this kind of went against the words of like Rosa Luxemburg in particular, but this is basically Karl Liebknecht and like especially many of the kind of people like below him, yeah, they were in favour of basically seizing the opportunity, yeah, because they're like, right, in the same way in Russia, you'd had, the February Revolution, which was just a general uprising, and then you had the Bolshevik Revolution, which basically seized the means of productions, right, and like took over like the apparatus of the state. This is what needs to happen in Germany. You've had like now the kind of like Weimar like kind of revolution as such, yeah. Now we need to have a proper socialist revolution. So this was what had basically been argued, and this kind of is something which we touched on in the Paris Commune one, right? When we spoke last time about like Blanquist, right? So Blanquist, as I kind of said in that video, was Lenin before Lenin was Lenin, right? Because what Blanquist was advocating for was a tiny elite of people basically taking control of the means of production and of like state apparatus, right? And not waiting on the great masses of people, yeah? And this is essentially the same approach that Lenin took in Russia. However, as happened with the Paris Commune, it ended up being a failure because the revolutionaries couldn't kind of agree, right? And because it kind of been so last minute and just like, well, let's kind of just make the most of it and stuff, right? They hadn't really made a plan of how this would really pan out and stuff, right? So this is basically why it ended up failing. So now that was the 5th of January 1919, you had this popular uprising, right? And the major problem with it, of course, is that as happens with all kind of revolutions like this, yeah, the government is not in favour of it. So as we said before, where they want to consolidate power, this is not helpful. And so Friedrich Ebert ended up basically wanting to crush this. However, it would have been very politically kind of messy had he called in the army to do this, yeah. The idea of basically sending the army in to like crush an uprising doesn't really bode very well, especially when this is meant to be kind of a liberal republic and stuff. It kind of looks a bit bad, right? So what they did instead of calling the army is they basically got a group of militia together, who were called the Freikorps. Now, the Freikorps, most of these had been former veterans who'd served on like the Western Front and stuff, so they're battle-hardened people. And on top of that, they're very much anti-communist, right, and very anti-socialist as well. And so for these people, they are like very much itching to basically crush any kind of like uprising that they can. And so by employing these Freikorps, it's a thing where, first of all, they are much more ruthless than like the regular kind of army would be. Second of all, they have a kind of like ideological kind of commitment to crushing this thing. And thirdly, unlike the army or unlike the police and stuff, there's no real accountability, right? They're basically just armed mobs, like patrolling the streets. And so they can kind of get away with doing whatever they want. And there's not really any way to kind of like rein them in and stuff, right? So it's kind of one of those things where Frederich Ebert uses the Freikorps basically to be able to crush the thing without getting his own hands dirty and stuff, and he doesn't really care about the kind of consequence of this, right? And the leaders of the movement, like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, they get arrested, they get handed over to the Freikorps, and because obviously like the German government can't be involved in what happens next, right? The Freikorps end up assassinating them. And then, they end up getting Rosa Luxemburg's body and throw it in a canal. And I believe like it wasn't seen again for another like few weeks and stuff. So people were searching for it, but it wasn't seen for another few weeks. And so, that's kind of how it ends up being like played out and stuff, right? And actually you can see this in the very good German film, which is Rosa Luxemburg. Is from 1986. There's also a new film which has come out in like 2019. I've not seen that one yet, so I can't really say whether that one's good or not, but definitely check out the one in 1986. It's actually really, really good. Obviously try and find one with like English subtitles if you can't speak German, but whatever, like kind of like the point is it's a really good movie, right? And it will kind of explain a lot about like the history of this, right? And that's kind of how the uprising ended. So very much like the Paris Commune, it's built on this kind of like idealistic kind of like stance, but at the end of the day, it's not really well thought out, and there's not really kind of any kind of follow-up plan, and it's crushed in a very like brutal way, much more brutally than the people who kind of planned it were expecting. They probably expected it to be just like the revolution had been a few months ago, where like the navy and the army kind of gets involved and like kind of takes the side of the revolutionaries. But people can put up with one revolution at a time. They can't like put up with multiple revolutions, especially once it become more and more radicalized. As the kind of saying goes, like the center must stand, or something like that. I can't remember now. But now that we've looked into the history of this, now we can kind of ask the question of what would have happened if it had been successful, right? Now, the massive caveat is this would never have happened. And it's never going to have happened for like multiple reasons yet.